She stood still against the morning sky, poised on the crown of a towering cactus, her silhouette sharp against the pale light. A ghost made of muscle and dust. 40 feet off the ground, in utter silence, a bobcat balanced on thorns. Not a twitch, not a sound. Just the wind whispering across the high desert. And then she jumped. She didn't fall. She flew. There was a moment, long enough to take one breath, maybe two, when time forgot to move. Her body stretched mid-air, limbs out like a diver cutting through water. Beneath her, dry earth waited with open arms or silent judgment. I didn't believe it when I first saw it. Not really. You don't expect that kind of courage from something wild. You think of fear, instincts, running, not this composure, not this quiet defiance of death. I think it changed me. That moment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started with two men. Not young anymore, but not done with the world either. Jack and Walter. They weren't heroes. They weren't the kind of men people wrote stories about. They had their aches and regrets, their morning rituals and unspoken silences. That morning, like most others, they rode their bikes along a quiet trail that traced the edge of the Blue River Valley, a place where pine and juniper meet open sky, and the air smells like time before asphalt. The trail wasn't crowded. It never was. Maybe a hawk overhead or a fox slipping into the underbrush. The kind of place where you could forget your phone existed. The kind of place you went to remember something you hadn't quite lost yet. Jack led the way, his electric bike humming low, tires crunching dry needles. Walter followed, slower, on the same beat-up mountain bike he'd ridden since his knees still worked like they should. He liked it better that way, to feel the world in every push. "You know what this place needs?" Jack called over his shoulder. Walter raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, a Starbucks and a chiropractor?" "No," Jack grinned. "A decent bench, one with a view and a cup holder." Walter smiled, that soft crinkle at the corner of his eyes. "You've forgotten how to sit still without a cup in your hand." They rode on. Up ahead, a gust of wind swept through the tall sage. A hawk cried. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled over the ridgeline, too distant to matter. And then, Jack stopped. No words. Just the sudden braking sound, the crunch of gravel. Walter pulled up beside him, heart climbing into his throat. "What is it?" he asked, scanning the trail. Jack didn't answer right away. He pointed. At first, Walter saw nothing, just a cactus, taller than the rest, rising like a green monument. But there, at the very top, was a shape that didn't belong, a shape that blinked. And that's when they saw her, still as stone, wrapped in sunlight, her golden eyes staring straight back. It was a bobcat, a full-grown female, crouched at the top of the cactus like she was born there. Jack let out a low breath. "You ever seen anything like that?" Walter shook his head. "No, never." They dismounted slowly, instinctively quieter than before, like approaching a sacred thing. The world around them stilled. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Why would she climb up there?" Jack whispered. Walter frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe she's hiding." Jack followed his gaze to the horizon, to the shadows under the trees, and something deep inside both of them shifted. Because you don't climb 40 feet of needles for no reason. And she had a reason. They just didn't know it yet. Jack had never believed in signs. Not really. He trusted things he could see and fix. A broken pipe, a flat tire, the soft leak in a coffee pot seal. But something about the way that bobcat looked at him from the top of that cactus, it was like she had been waiting. Walter, on the other hand, was quieter about his beliefs. He carried a small leather pouch in his backpack, not for tools or snacks, but for memories. Inside was a folded flannel shirt, the kind with faded red and navy stripes, worn thin from years of washing. It had belonged to his daughter. Her name was Emma. She'd loved animals, drew them, read about them, whispered to them like they were old friends. When she was 10, she rescued a crow with a broken wing, fed it crushed walnuts with a spoon. It stayed on their porch for 3 weeks. Walter hadn't had the heart to tell her it would probably never fly again. One morning, it was just gone. Emma called it a miracle. Walter just nodded, said maybe it had found its wings again. After the accident, he started carrying that shirt. Not every day. Just when the silence felt heavier than usual. Like today. "Jack," Walter said now, voice low. "Something's not right." Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, she's not just up there for a view." The two men stepped off the trail, gravel crunching under their boots as they approached the cactus from a respectful distance. The bobcat didn't move. Her gaze followed them. Not wild panic, not fear, just watchfulness, a calculation. Walter squinted toward the trees beyond the cactus, thick with blue spruce and ironwood. Something shifted there, a tremble in the leaves, or maybe just a feeling in his chest, a tightening. He felt the wind change direction, carried with it something sharp, musky, feral, predator. He took one step closer to Jack. "You smell that?" Jack raised his head slightly. "Yeah, not good." They stood there for a while, letting the pieces of the scene settle in. The cactus, the bobcat, the wind, the silence. And then Jack spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Do you remember the dog? The one I had back in Idaho?" Walter looked over. "Sadie?" "Yeah, when she got sick, she used to crawl under the porch, hide away. I never knew why, until the vet told me. Some animals, when they know they're vulnerable, they find a high place, or a dark one, somewhere they think danger won't follow." Walter nodded, eyes returning to the bobcat. "But she's not hiding from sickness," he said. "She's hiding from something that's hunting her." They both looked toward the line of trees again, and for a heartbeat, they saw it, a flicker of movement just beyond the light. Broad shoulders, a shifting shadow. Two golden eyes reflecting the morning sun, like coins tossed into a wishing well. Jack whispered, "Mountain lion." And suddenly the air changed. Everything felt thinner, like the space between each breath had grown wider, riskier. The bobcat shifted, the smallest motion. And it was then they saw it. Blood, tiny dark spots on her paws. Her body trembled slightly with the effort of balancing. She wasn't resting. She was enduring because she had to. Walter tightened his grip on the bike handlebars. A sound rose in the distance. A mourning dove, soft and slow. And in the stillness that followed, a new question settled in the air between them. If she was up there, what was she protecting down here? He turned back toward the trail, toward a small rise of boulders and dry grass. His breath caught. Behind the rock, just barely visible, was the entrance to a crevice, a natural shelter, dark and cool, and from inside a faint sound. A cry, high-pitched, fragile, alive. Jack heard it too. They looked at each other. No words needed. She wasn't just running for her life. She was fighting for someone else's. The weight of it fell heavy in their chests. This wasn't just nature being nature. This was something else, something ancient, something maternal. A vow made with blood and claws and teeth. Walter felt his heart ache in a way it hadn't in years. He closed his eyes and saw Emma's smile. Somewhere nearby, in that hidden pocket of stone and silence, were lives waiting for her return. And all she could do now was wait. Walter took a step back, letting the weight of the moment settle like morning frost across his skin. The cry had been so faint, he wondered if he'd imagined it. But deep down, he knew better. There was life tucked inside those rocks. Small, hidden, helpless. Jack hadn't spoken. He stood still, eyes fixed on the cactus crown, as if by staring long enough he could absorb some of the strength it took to perch there. The bobcat didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her body, lean and battered, clung to that crown of needles with a grace that wasn't about elegance. It was about necessity. Every twitch of muscle looked calculated, every breath earned. "I don't think she can hold on much longer," Walter murmured. Jack finally exhaled, slow and steady. "Then we don't have long either." They moved carefully now, circling wide to avoid startling her. The ground was uneven. The cactus stood like a tower in a battlefield, and somewhere in the tree line, that other presence still lingered, silent, waiting. The mountain lion had vanished into the underbrush, but he hadn't left. Jack could feel it, like the low static hum before a storm. A predator's patience wasn't loud. It was heavy. "You ever hear about those guys in British Columbia?" Walter said suddenly, his voice low. Jack glanced over. "What guys?" "Couple of hikers, maybe 5 years ago. Found a black bear up a pine tree, shaking like a leaf. Turned out a cougar had been shadowing them all morning. Bear scrambled for height. Cats don't climb when it's not worth the risk." Jack nodded slowly. "Means she's cornered." Walter's gaze returned to the bobcat. "Means she's been up there a while." They stopped beside a low boulder, crouching for cover. From here they could see the cactus clearly. Could see her front paws, swollen, punctured, ringed with dried blood. Still, she didn't cry out, didn't whimper. She endured. Jack whispered, "You ever see anything that proud? In that much pain?" Walter didn't answer. Not at first. His fingers drifted into the pouch at his side, brushing the fabric of that old flannel shirt. A part of him always carried Emma's voice, the way she used to sing under her breath when she thought no one was listening. The way she used to cradle broken things, birds, stray dogs, a half-frozen kitten once found in a drainpipe. She'd called them all warriors, even the weakest ones, especially them. And now here was one more, clinging to life for the sake of lives unseen. The wind changed again. A dry gust carried dust across the ridge. Jack wiped his eyes, more from grit than grief, but the effect was the same. When he turned to Walter, there was a new steel in his voice. "If she falls, those kits down there don't stand a chance." Walter nodded. "And if we leave, neither does she." But what could two aging men do against a predator that could tear them both apart before either reached the trailhead? They weren't armed. They didn't have flares or bear spray. What they had was instinct and the bitter, beautiful stubbornness that comes from being too old to walk away from something that matters. They stayed low, whispering ideas, each more useless than the last. "We could make noise." Tried that with a bull moose once. Didn't end well. Rocks? We'd have to be a whole lot closer to get his attention. And then Walter paused. His eyes drifted to Jack's bike, the electric one. Bright red, sleek, and covered in buttons Jack still hadn't figured out. "Jack, does your bike have a siren?" Jack blinked. A what? You said it had one of those anti-theft things. Something obnoxious. Maybe it's enough to spook him. Jack rubbed his jaw. I mean, maybe. I've never tried it. Probably just a chirp or some lights. Could just annoy him. Or, Walter said, voice growing steadier, it could sound like something even he doesn't understand. Something man-made. Something wrong. Jack looked at the buttons. His thumb hovered over the smallest one, the one he'd never pressed. They shared a look, and in that breathless pause, a sound broke through the stillness. A low growl. It came from the base of the hill, deep, rolling, patient. The mountain lion hadn't left. He was circling, not charging, not yet, but reminding them that the desert had rules, and this wasn't their home. Walter rose slightly, enough to see over the ridge. There he was, golden, immense, scarred. His muzzle torn by time, one ear notched, tail flicking slowly like a clock hand measuring fate. He locked eyes with Walter. And for the first time in years, Walter felt small. Really, truly small. Jack's finger pressed the button. The world shattered. It wasn't a siren so much as a scream, a mechanical bone-deep shriek that cut through the air like a blade of lightning. The bike erupted with sound, a jagged wail of wee-oo, beep-beep whir that echoed off stone and bark and sky like a fire alarm had mated with a UFO. The silence of the wilderness, so carefully kept by the wind and trees, broke apart in an instant. Birds launched from branches. A nearby rabbit darted for cover. The bobcat flinched, her paws gripping tighter to the cactus spines, eyes wide with shock. For the first time since they'd found her body moved with something close to panic. But she didn't fall. She stayed. Below, the mountain lion reared back, startled, his ears flattened against his skull. His head jerked toward the sound, eyes narrowing, unsure. He took a step back. Jack stared, heart pounding in his throat. It's working, he muttered. The mountain lion turned, facing them now. Not retreating, assessing. His muscles coiled beneath golden fur, tail lashing once. And then, with a rumble of frustration that seemed to shake the earth beneath their feet, he backed away. Slowly. Then faster. And then he was gone, melting into the underbrush like a ghost. The siren wailed on. Walter rushed to the bike, fumbling with the buttons, punching them at random, until finally, the noise ceased. Silence rolled back in like the tide. They stood there, blinking. Jack's hands trembled. I think I forgot how to breathe. Walter let out a long exhale, almost a laugh. Almost. They turned toward the cactus. She was still there, but she was different now. The tension in her shoulders had loosened. Her head lifted, her gaze drifted from the trees to the empty trail where the predator had stood. And then, for the first time, she looked down at them. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. Not something human. But it was awareness. A moment shared. Not of debt, but of understanding. Walter felt something behind his eyes sting. He didn't know why. She moved. Slow at first. Paws adjusting one by one across the unforgiving needles. Every shift was pain. They could see it in the tightness of her limbs, the way her back legs trembled. And then she rose, fully. Balanced at the very peak of that cactus, 40 feet in the air, she looked like a statue carved from desert light and dusk. And without warning, she leapt. It was not a fall. It was deliberate, controlled. Her body extended like an arrow loosed from an ancient bow. Jack gasped. Walter stepped forward, heart clutched in his chest. She struck the earth with the sound of something soft, hitting something unforgiving. Rolled. Came to a stop. For a second she didn't move, and then she rose, shook, steadied, and ran, not away, past them. So close Walter could see the shimmer of blood on her pads. So near Jack felt the air shift in her wake. She didn't look back. Not until the last second. At the edge of the trail she turned. Her eyes met Jack's, then Walter's. There was something ancient in them. Wild, fierce. But there was also something else. Something that said, "I see you." And then she vanished into the trees. They didn't speak for a while. The wind returned. The clouds above had thickened. Somewhere in the distance, thunder spoke again, closer this time. Jack sat down slowly on a nearby rock, rubbed his palms across his jeans. "I didn't think that would work," he said finally. Walter sat beside him. "Neither did I." They stared at the cactus. Empty now. Crowned only with needles and blood. The cactus stood like a silent witness, its arms raised skyward, its crown now bare save for the faint red stains that marked where she'd stood. A spiked throne of endurance, now vacant. Walter found himself tracing a small groove in the rock beneath his hand. He didn't know why. Maybe he just needed something solid, something cold. His heart was still climbing down from somewhere high and dangerous. Jack leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the spot where the bobcat had vanished. "She knew," he murmured. Walter looked over. Knew what? Jack didn't take his eyes off the trail. That we weren't a threat. That we were trying to help. The way she looked at us, I don't know. It was like she waited for us to come. Walter didn't reply. He was listening again. And there it was. That sound. Soft, thin, a thread of life woven into the air. A kitten's cry. They rose together, slow, cautious, drawn toward the outcrop where the sound had first stirred Walter's chest like an old bell being rung after years of silence. The rock formation wasn't large, but it was jagged and uneven, the kind of place a small animal could hide for days unseen. Walter moved ahead, his steps careful. The flannel shirt in his pack pressed against his back with comforting weight. He crouched near a cleft between two slabs of stone, peered inside, and there, in the soft dark, were three tiny shapes. He exhaled. They were smaller than he expected. Spotted fur, oversized ears, eyes still holding that milky kitten blue. One paw batted at another's tail, another yawned, showing off a mouth no bigger than a thimble. They weren't scared. Not exactly. Just waiting. Waiting for her. Walter backed away slowly. They're there, all three, alive. Jack stepped beside him, squinting into the shadows. How the hell did she even make it up that cactus with those feet and still have the strength to come back for them? Walter straightened up, brushing dust from his knees. Because she had to. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. They retreated a little, giving the den space. They knew enough about wild things to know she wouldn't return if they lingered too close. So they found a flat patch of ground beneath a stand of pines and waited. Not because they expected a show, not even because they thought she'd return right away. They waited because it felt right. Jack pulled out a water bottle, offered it to Walter first, then took a long drink himself. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was earned. After a while, Jack cleared his throat. "Remember that trip to Flathead Lake?" Walter looked up. "Yeah." "When Emma found the owl with the broken wing?" Walter smiled faintly. "She named him Albert, even made him a splint out of a popsicle stick and gauze." Jack chuckled. I'll never forget the look on your face when she tried to feed him beef jerky. Walter's eyes misted, but he didn't wipe them. She believed anything could heal, if someone just tried. There was a pause. Then Jack said, almost too softly, I think you believed it too. You just stopped saying it out loud. The wind picked up, stirring the trees above. A pine cone dropped nearby, startling a lizard from its hiding place. The world was moving again. And then, from the ridge above the den, she appeared. The bobcat. Her movement was slow, cautious. Her limbs betrayed her exhaustion, each step deliberate as if testing the ground before trusting it. Walter held his breath. She paused at the edge of the rocks, looked straight at them, didn't flinch, didn't blink. And then she vanished into the den. A minute passed, then 2. Soft rustling, a sound like fur on stone. A high-pitched mew, then another. Then silence. She was home. Walter turned to Jack. Let's go. Jack hesitated, but nodded. Yeah, let's give them their peace. They mounted their bikes in silence, turning back toward the path that had brought them here. The trail looked different now, not just a stretch of dirt and rock. It looked watched. Blessed, maybe. Marked. As they reached the bend where the cactus first came into view, Jack slowed. He looked back, and on the ridge, silhouetted against the growing light, she stood once more. Not high above now, but grounded. Still, she watched them go. Not as prey, not as threat, as something else. And when she turned to return to her den, tail low, steps steady, it felt like something inside both men had shifted. Not broken, mended. They didn't speak for the next mile. The sound of tires crunching over pine needles and gravel filled the silence between them, and that was enough. Not every silence needed filling. Not when your chest already carried too much weight, the kind you can't name, only feel. Walter's legs burned. The incline wasn't steep, but it asked something of him, and he gave it without complaint. His thoughts drifted like mist across a still lake, back to his daughter. Emma had loved stories like this. The brave mother, the wild rescue. She would have wanted every detail, would have drawn the cactus in crayon and called it something like Spine Castle. He smiled at the thought. The years hadn't dulled the sharpness of losing her. It didn't ache like it used to, not every day, but grief has this habit of curling up inside you, like a sleeping dog. Most days, it just rests. But sometimes, something stirs it, like a bobcat leaping from the sky. He reached back and touched the corner of the flannel shirt that peeked out from his pack. He hadn't planned to bring it today. It had just come along. Up ahead, Jack pulled to a stop at a clearing that overlooked the entire stretch of valley. Pines lined the edges, and in the distance, a hawk circled slowly, riding thermals. Walter stopped beside him, catching his breath. Jack didn't look at him. He just spoke into the open space. You know, I think I was wrong. About what? About signs. About things meaning things. Walter glanced over. Jack still wasn't looking at him. His eyes were on the sky. You remember my dog, Sadie? Walter nodded. Of course. When she was dying, she started doing this weird thing. Wouldn't sleep in the house. Started scratching at the back door until I let her out. Every night she'd go sit by the old barn. Just sit there in the dark, facing the woods. Like she was waiting for something. He paused, rubbed the back of his neck. I used to think it was just instinct. Dogs do strange things at the end. But now... He finally turned to Walter. That cat today, she wasn't just surviving. She was making sure she was seen. She climbed that cactus knowing she'd be visible. That's not hiding. That's calling. Walter took a long breath. The air was cooler here, cleaner. He let it fill his lungs before answering. Emma used to say, animals talk to people who listen. Maybe we finally listened today. Jack gave a small, crooked smile. Yeah, maybe we did. They stood there for a while, watching the wind move across the trees like a living thing. The sky above was shifting, clouds drawing close in slow procession. Thunder again, soft this time. No rain yet. Just a reminder. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photo. Worn, corners curling, black and white. He handed it to Walter. It was a younger Jack, maybe early 30s, standing beside a rusted pickup truck, grinning with a dog at his feet. Sadie. Tongue out, eyes bright. Pure joy in both faces. You kept this? Walter asked. Jack nodded. Never leave home without it. Just don't show it to the grandkids. They already think I'm sentimental enough. Walter handed it back gently. They sat on a fallen log and opened 2 granola bars, the kind with more seeds than scent. Neither was particularly hungry, but sometimes the act of eating reminds you you're still alive. As they chewed in silence, the forest around them began to move again. A deer darted through the brush 100 yards off. A jay called out overhead, and somewhere, far behind them, the faintest sound of kittens crying for their mother was answered by a low, familiar growl. She was there, with them, feeding them, curling around them like a shield. Jack leaned back and looked at the sky. You think they'll make it? Walter's answer was soft but sure. I think they already have. The pine trees creaked gently in the wind. In that moment, it didn't feel like just 2 men resting on a trail. It felt like something sacred, like standing in the doorway between 2 worlds, the one you know, and the one that watches you from just beyond the tree line. A world where a bobcat becomes a mother, a cactus becomes a fortress, and 2 old friends become something braver than they knew they still were. And somehow, that felt enough for today. Maybe even tomorrow, too. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the sky had begun to change. Not quickly, the kind of slow drift only noticed when you've been watching the world too long. The clouds thickened with purpose, as if the land was holding its breath for something quiet and heavy. Walter slowed first, pulling his bike off the trail to a small overlook. It wasn't marked on any maps, but both men had found it years ago on a wandering ride. A clearing surrounded by dogwood and sage, with an old wooden fence someone had built long ago, now half-rotted, the paint flaking like memory. Jack followed without a word, parking his bike and joining him by the fence. They looked out over the valley below, where the pines melted into golden fields and streams curved like handwriting across the earth. Somewhere out there, the bobcat curled around her kits, her body still bleeding, her spirit still fierce. Neither man said it, but both thought the same thing. She had won, not with teeth, not with speed, with something older. Persistence, love, and the refusal to give in to fear. Jack took a deep breath. You ever wonder, he said slowly, if the wild things remember us? Walter tilted his head. What do you mean? If they remember kindness or terror. If, a year from now, she'll walk that same ridge and know this is where the noise came from, the one that saved her. Walter looked down, thinking. I think they remember the way we do, not with words, with feelings, with how the air tasted, the shape of a sound, the scent of safety. Jack nodded. Yeah, That sounds about right. They sat on the low rail of the fence, listening to the hush that followed their words. The kind of silence that only exists in places untouched by clocks or calendars. Walter reached into his pack and pulled out the flannel shirt. He held it for a moment, then unfolded it and laid it across his lap. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, his eyes not quite meeting Jack's. "All the time," Jack said honestly, "but not the way I used to." "How's that?" Jack paused. "I used to think leaving meant running. Now I think it just means looking in a new direction." Walter nodded, brushing a thumb over a loose thread on the shirt sleeve. He thought about Emma. Not just the smile, or the laugh, or the drawings, but the way she used to lean against him when she was little. Wordless, trusting. That bobcat had done the same, in her own way. She had leaned on them, trusted something wordless, something older than understanding. And that trust, it meant something. Suddenly, a sound broke through the stillness, not from the valley, but from behind. The rustling of brush, a quick, darting movement. They turned, slow, alert. Not fear, not yet. Just readiness. A shape emerged from the trees, not a predator, not a threat. A fox, young, thin, its fur mottled with the shift of seasons. It stopped a few yards away, head tilted, eyes bright. Watching them. Jack smiled. "Well, look who's curious." The fox sniffed the air, then stepped cautiously closer. Walter didn't move. He just watched, heart thudding in his chest for no clear reason. The animal stopped again, just out of reach. Then, gently, it lowered itself to the ground and lay down. Just like that. Not sleeping, not resting, just being. With them, Jack whispered, "I think the forest is saying thank you." Walter's throat tightened. He looked at the fox, quiet, wild, unafraid, and thought about the strange and beautiful way animals sometimes chose to stay, even when they didn't have to. The fox rose after a minute, turned, and vanished into the trees with no fanfare. Jack stood slowly. Well, that's enough magic for one day. Walter folded the flannel shirt again, placing it back in his pack. But before he zipped it shut, he hesitated. Then, with care, he removed a single button from the shirt. Small, simple, faded with time. He walked to the fence post and set it there, not as a memorial, as a marker, a way of saying we were here, we saw, we understood. He didn't tell Jack why he did it. He didn't need to. Some things are better left to the wild. That night, the storm finally came. It began as a low rumble against the mountain's edge, like a throat clearing in the distance. Then the sky began to pulse with faint flashes. Silent at first, just light dancing behind clouds. The rain waited, held itself back like a story not yet ready to be told. Jack sat on the porch of his cabin, a single lantern casting warm amber across the railing. The air smelled of pine and ozone. The bike leaned against the wall nearby, still dust-covered, its digital display dark. He held a mug of coffee, though it had long gone cold. In his lap, an old photo album sat open, pages thick with plastic sleeves and fading ink. Sadie's ears perked up from 100 memories ago, her tongue forever caught mid-laugh. He smiled faintly, running a thumb across the edge of the image. When the first drops fell, he didn't move, just listened. A soft knock came at the door. Walter stepped in, damp from the walk over, boots muddy, flannel jacket soaked through. "I figured you'd be out here," he said. Jack gestured to the second chair, pulled from the corner. "Still got a little room on the porch." Walter dropped into the seat, groaning like old hinges. Knees feel every storm these days. They sat in the hush that only rain brings. Not silence exactly, but something gentler. Something that wraps itself around your bones and asks you to remember. Walter pulled something from his coat pocket. A tiny pine cone, no bigger than a walnut. "Found it near the den," he said, turning it in his hand. "Figured the kits might play with it when they're older." Jack nodded. "If they make it." "They will." They both watched the forest line, now obscured by mist and falling water. Jack spoke again, quieter this time. "You ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't stopped? If we'd just ridden past that bend, like we always do?" Walter looked out toward the trees, eyes distant. "Yeah, I do." He thought of the bobcat, her eyes burning even through fear, her paws bloodied by thorns, her leap, that impossible, defiant arc through the sky. He thought of her landing, the stumble, the strength that followed. And he thought of her running toward them, not away, trusting, or maybe just too desperate not to. "But we did stop," Walter said, "and that's what matters." Jack sipped his cold coffee, made a face. "You always drank that stuff like it was punishment," Walter smirked. "Gives me an excuse to complain. Keeps me young." They chuckled, and for a moment the heaviness lifted. Then Jack asked the question he hadn't dared until now. "Why today, Walt? Why'd you bring the shirt?" Walter didn't answer at first. Just looked down at his boots, watched the water run off the toes in tiny rivers. "It's her birthday," he said quietly. "She would have been 32. Jack's breath caught. Walter smiled faintly, not out of joy, but memory. She loved the rain. Said it made the world softer, like the trees exhaled. Jack looked back at the storm. It was stronger now, the wind pushing sheets of rain across the clearing. "I think she would have liked today," he said. Walter nodded. "Yeah, I think she did." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The storm moved around them, not violent, just steady, cleansing. Walter reached into his coat again, this time pulling something wrapped in a small cloth. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a carved stone figure. Crude, small, the shape of a bobcat. "Found it years ago," he said. "Some artist must have lost it near the riverbank. I kept it in the drawer, didn't know why." He placed it gently on the porch railing, where the rain could wash over it. "Now I do." Jack watched it sit there, collecting droplets like tiny tears. In the distance, a howl broke through the storm. Not a cry of pain, a call, the kind of sound that travels through time, through forests, through hearts. Walter closed his eyes and whispered, "She made it back." Jack didn't question how he knew. Some things you don't need proof to believe. Some things you just feel. In your bones, in your chest, in the way the earth seems to settle after something sacred passes through. They stayed on the porch until the storm began to fade. Not because they were waiting for something more, but because, for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt the need to leave. Morning came slow. The storm had passed sometime in the night, leaving the world rinsed and still. Mist curled between the trees like smoke, and the sky stretched pale and wide, painted in soft strokes of blue and silver. Walter stood by the edge of the meadow, boots wet with dew. He hadn't said a word since they left the cabin, just pointed a direction and started walking. Jack followed, knowing better than to interrupt whatever thread his friend was unraveling inside. They moved through the pines like ghosts, their footsteps cushioned by pine needles. The world quiet save for the occasional drip of water from branch to earth. Eventually, they reached the cactus. It looked different in daylight. Less like a tower of desperation, more like a monument. The blood had dried into rust-colored stains. The crown bore no trace of her now. She had come and gone, but the cactus remembered. Jack approached it with reverence. He didn't touch it, just looked. Tilted his head, as if seeing it through her eyes. What it must have felt like to climb, step by agonizing step. Not for glory, not for strength, but because there was no other choice. Walter stood back, eyes scanning the tree line. "You see anything?" Jack asked. Walter shook his head. "No, but I feel her." They moved toward the rocks again, toward the crevice where the kits had been. They didn't expect to find them. They didn't want to. Wild things needed distance to thrive. But something in them had needed to return. The den was quiet now. No cries, no rustling. But there, in the dirt just outside the entrance, were paw prints. Small ones, and larger ones layered atop. The mother's. Fresh. Walter crouched, fingertips tracing the edges. "They're gone," he said. "She moved them. Where to?" "Wherever they'll be safest." Jack smiled faintly. Smart girl. They sat for a while, just watching the morning rise over the valley. Sunlight filtered through the trees in soft columns, dust dancing in its beams. Jack pulled a small tin from his jacket, 2 pieces of jerky and a square of dark chocolate. He handed Walter the chocolate without asking. They chewed in silence. Walter said, "When I first lost her, I used to come out here just to feel alone. But now, I think this is where I feel her the most." Jack nodded. "You think that's her gift? The way she loved the world so hard it stayed behind, even after she left?" "Yeah," Walter said. "I think some love is too big to disappear. It just changes shape." They both looked toward the woods. And then, as if conjured by thought, she appeared, far off. A ridge over. The bobcat. She stood tall, her shape backlit by morning sun. One ear twitched, her tail flicked once. And beside her, barely visible, were 3 smaller shapes. The kittens. Jack's breath caught. He reached for Walter's arm, just to confirm what he was seeing. Walter didn't speak. His face softened, mouth parted slightly in awe. She looked down at them, eyes catching the light. And in that still golden moment, she blinked. Slowly, deliberately. A gesture more ancient than language. A gesture of trust. Then she turned, her body low and fluid, and slipped back into the trees with her children at her side. Walter exhaled. "That was goodbye?" Jack nodded. "No. That was thank you." They didn't follow. They didn't need to. Some stories end with doors closing, or lights fading, or words spoken aloud. But this one ended with a blink, and it said everything they needed to hear. The air was different now. Not just lighter, clearer somehow. Like the forest itself had exhaled. The scent of pine and damp earth lingered as Jack and Walter made their way back along the ridge, every step quieter than the last. They didn't talk much on the walk down. Words felt unnecessary. The kind of stillness they carried wasn't empty. It was full of images, of breath, of understanding. By the time the trailhead came into view, the sun had fully risen. Birds moved between branches, calling softly to one another. Somewhere in the distance, a stream whispered over rock. At the base of an old wooden signpost, Walter paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, the pine cone he'd carried since the den. He crouched down and placed it beside a cluster of wildflowers. Not as a shrine, just a gesture, a symbol of something that had begun and ended in silence. Jack looked over. You think we'll ever see her again? Walter stood. No. But that's not the point, is it? Jack smiled. No, I guess it's not. They loaded their bikes into the back of Jack's old pickup, its tailgate creaking like a familiar song. The kind of sound that tells you you're home, even if you never quite meant to be. As they climbed into the cab, Jack hesitated, then reached over to the glove compartment and pulled out a pen. He wrote something small, right above the dashboard where the sun had faded the paint. Walter leaned over to read it. Leap for the ones you love. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They drove back in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have lived through something without needing to define it. And though the road curved and the trees shifted and the world returned to its usual rhythm, something inside them had changed. Not broken, not hardened, just softened in all the right places. That evening, back at his cabin, Walter stood in front of a shelf lined with old books, half-used candles, and dusty picture frames. He reached for the little carved stone bobcat and placed it gently next to a photo of Emma, a candid one, taken just after a rainstorm. Her hair wild and her smile wide. He lit a small candle beside it. No prayer, no ritual, just presence. And before he turned away, he whispered a single phrase, "Thank you for the leap." Outside, night fell soft over the forest. And somewhere, deep in the underbrush, beneath the stars, and far beyond the reach of roads, a mother bobcat curled around her kits, her body tired but her heart unbroken. The wind passed gently through the pines, and the wild, as it always does, remembered.